Welcome to this virtual session of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. I'm Alberto Ibargüen, president of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which is dedicated to strengthening democracy by supporting informed and engaged communities. In service of that mission, we also support dialogue on great issues of the day for our country, including free expression, trust, media, and democracy, and of course, American values and education, where they most frequently converge and sometimes conflict in college athletics. KCIA was founded in 1989 by Father Theodore Hesburgh of Notre Dame, Bill Friday of the University of North Carolina, and Creed Black, my predecessor as president of Knight Foundation. From the beginning, Knight Foundation has been the sole supporter of the commission, giving it the freedom to act, choose subjects to consider, and even decide whether to continue. The Knight Commission's work focuses on the student athlete and helps to foster transparency in a college sports system that is complex and often financially opaque. Today's session will continue that important work. The commission is led by co-chairs Arnie Duncan and Carol Cartwright. Dr. Cartwright and Knight Commission member Jonathan Mariner will lead today's session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alberto. Over the next several weeks, the Commission will hold a series of public forums examining the Division I model and the need for reform, culminating with recommendations for change. The Commission has a legacy of designing and advancing reforms that strengthen the educational mission of college sports. Last December, prior to the pandemic, the Commission announced that in light of the many challenges facing college sports, it would examine more far-reaching reforms and explore new models for alternative structures for Division I college sports, with a special focus on the impact of FBS football. Since the advent of the pandemic, that examination has become even more urgent and timely. Our four-part series of virtual forums entitled Transforming the D1 Model will provide facts and data that suggest a new model is needed for Division I sports and will examine what potential major changes could look like. Following this session, we'll answer questions and give a short summary of the other three virtual sessions that will follow this one. Now I'll turn it over to the chair of our commission's College Sports Finances Committee, Jonathan Mariner, to discuss today's forum.
Thank you, Carol. To give some context for today's presentation, I'd like to begin by noting that nearly 10 years ago, the Commission released a major report advancing a blueprint for strengthening accountability for college sports entitled Restoring the Balance, Dollars, Values, and the Future of College Sports. One of the report's core recommendations was to require greater financial transparency of athletics spending. The Commission believed then, as it does now, that more effective disclosure of revenues, spending, and financial priorities enhances the ability of institutions to ensure athletics programs are advancing the mission of higher education. To improve transparency and accountability, the Commission created a user-friendly database that details D1 revenues and expenses based on institutionally reported data. This database is a College Athletics Financial Information Database, or CAFI database for short. Today's presentation will explain the flow of money. There are vast financial differences between Division I institutions and conferences. But beyond those differences, there are worrisome trends and growing financial challenges that suggest a new D1 model is needed. I will turn it over now to Knight Commission CEO Amy Perko, who will lead the presentation.
Thank you, Jonathan. First, my associate, Dr. Scott Hirko, will be a co-presenter. Scott is the project manager for the Knight Commission's College Athletics Financial Information Database. We're also pleased to have a guest presenter, AJ Maestas, founder and CEO of Navigate. A few housekeeping items. If you have a question, please select the Q&A icon on your control panel. You can type a question at any time. We will answer your questions at the conclusion of our presentation. If you are a member of the media, please identify your affiliation with your question. Also identify the presenter or speaker to whom the question is directed. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up after the session. Today's session is being recorded and will be available through a link provided by email, as well as posted on our website, knightcommission.org. So let's get started in breaking down Division I finances. The first several slides will provide an overview of the entire landscape of Division I finances. With so many questions swirling around college sports, it is critical to have the facts about how the money generated is used. It's important to note that the data we are discussing today are drawn from NCAA financial reports filed by each public Division I institution. We partner with the Syracuse University, Newhouse School of Journalism, and they manage collecting the reports through open records request. The data are from the 2018 fiscal year. This first slide provides an orientation for the slides that will follow, and those slides will provide more color, both literally and contextually, about where the money goes and where the money comes from in college sports. Let's look at the budgets for Division I. From left to right, the slides break down Division I into its 3 subdivisions. Starting with the bar on the left that shows the total for the football bowl subdivision schools. The FBS is made up of 130 schools. 109 of those schools are public institutions and are represented in these data. What follows are 4 bars that group the FBS public schools by spending quartile. Quartile 1 are the schools with the largest athletics budgets, which range from $207 to $117 million in 2018. Quartile 2 schools budgets range from $116 to $65 million. Quartiles 1 and 2 include schools in the 5 richest conferences, commonly referred to as the Power 5, or in NCAA terminology, Autonomy 5. We will reference this distinct group more in the presentation. Quartiles 3 and 4 are the schools with the smallest budgets in Division I FBS, with budgets ranging from $61 to $36 million in Quartile 3 and $26 to $16 million in Quartile 4. So budgets in the FBS span over $200 million to $16 million. The next bar represents Division I schools in the football championship subdivision. Athletic budgets in this subdivision range from $52 million to $4 million. And the final bar to the right represents Division I schools without football, with budgets from $35 to $4 million. So in summary, as you can see, in 2018, Division I budgets ranged from $207 million to the lowest of $4 million. March Madness is the glue that holds this very diverse membership of 351 institutions together. Again, these graphs show only the public institutions in this membership, but we do have aggregate data on private institutions from several years ago that can be accessed on our website, knightcommission.org. So now let's add some color to the slides and look at where the money goes. The legend on the right breaks down the expense categories. The color being added to the bars will show each category as a percentage of the overall budget. We will start with the most important expense category, and that is athletic scholarships, shown in dark blue. As you can see, Division I schools with the smallest budgets spend a much greater percentage of their budget on athletic scholarships. The next 3 categories are the other significant expense categories. Administrative and support staff compensation, as well as severance pay, is shown in pink. Coaching compensation in dark red. Facilities, including debt service and equipment, in lime green. And other expense categories, including game expenses and travel, recruiting, competition guarantees, medical expenses, and a grouping for other expenses, and a very small sliver in Quartile 1 of 1% for net transfers back to the institution. Again, across all of Division I, the allocation of budget is relatively similar, as you can see, except that schools with smaller budgets spend a much larger proportion of their budgets on athletic scholarships, which again is represented in the dark blue. Now let's look at where the money comes from. Again, the legend of revenue sources is on the right. And we'll start with institutional and government support and student fees, which are in the orange and dark red. As these bars build, you can quickly see the major difference in revenue sources. The majority of Division I schools rely on student fees and institutional support to fund their athletics programs. One important point here is that the Knight Commission supports athletics being part of the overall university mission. So there's no judgment being made on the level of institutional investment in athletics programs. But from a policy standpoint, it's important to understand the vast difference among these schools with regard to revenue sources. Again, after these two revenue sources, the other sources are all externally generated revenues. And the first is ticket sales, shown in purple. As we look at these revenue sources, it's important to again note that the top two quartiles include the public schools and the Power 5 conferences. And the top revenue source for these schools is media rights, shown in light blue. These revenues include money from conference media contracts or conference networks, the college football playoff and postseason football, and to a lesser degree, NCAA distributions. Competition guarantees is another source of revenues. The next largest source are donor contributions, in lime green. Then we have corporate sponsorship and advertising, and a grouping that includes other revenues for things like camps, concessions, and parking. This next slide takes a look at the core purpose of why we have college sports, providing educational opportunities through sports. This figure looks at the sports teams offered across Division I with the same grouping of schools. The legend on the right highlights that FBS institutions are required to have a minimum of 16 teams. Division I non-FBS institutions are required to have a minimum of 14 teams. Each bar shows the high number of sports an institution offers in that grouping of schools, and the low number as well as the median for each grouping. Across each subdivision, the median number of sports being offered is highest for those that have larger budgets, from a median of 21 in quartile 1 to a median of 16.5 in Division I no football. However, the differences are not as great as the budget differences, and there are schools with the smallest budgets that have more sports than schools with the largest budgets, as you can see. As an example, a school in quartile 1 with the highest budget sponsors 18 sports, and a school with the lowest budget bracket sponsors 22. Again, these are based on 2018 data, and the financial impact of the pandemic is affecting these numbers across the board. Since the start of this year, 87 Division I sports teams have been dropped. 52 of these teams are at public universities represented in the data on this chart. The reduction of opportunities in Division I is an outcome that no one wants to see, and schools in conferences with the most resources have also made cuts. This slide will take a look at the schools with the most resources. So this slide highlights how the money has changed by focusing on the revenue growth for the 5 richest conferences that are part of the Power 5. As you can see, this slide highlights how the money has changed dramatically since 2005 for the Power 5 conferences through only 2 sources of revenue. The blue are conference revenues, primarily generated through conference media contracts or conference-owned networks and postseason football, particularly the college football playoff, which launched in 2015. Media experts have explained that 80 to 85% of the value of the conference media contracts are tied to FBS football. And given that these data in blue also represent the CFP distributions, the large majority of revenues are tied to FBS football. The red are distributions from the NCAA. These funds are generated by the NCAA from the March Madness tournament. Again, this figure does not include institutionally generated revenues like ticket sales or donor contributions. As the slides show, the combined total in 2005 for conference and NCAA generated revenues was $570 million, which you can see in the bottom bar in green. And during that year, the NCAA distribution was 1/5 of the total. The conference revenues exploded over the ensuing decade, and in 2015, the combined total broke the $2 billion in annual revenues mark. As you can see, NCAA distributions became less than 10% of the total. We produced this graph in 2016, and the future projections we made then were on the mark. A recent USA Today analysis showed 2019 revenues that exceeded our conservative projection of $2.8 billion in 2020. Now, clearly 2020 will be impacted by the pandemic. Later in our program, we will hear from Navigate Research CEO, AJ Maestas, about his company's future outlook for these programs if historical trends return after the pandemic. So now let's take a look at how these revenues have created two different revenue models in the FBS. The public schools, with a few exceptions, are either in conferences that are considered Power 5 conference members or the Group of 5 conferences. The conference memberships of each group is shown here in these slides. The legend below the bar graphs identify the revenue sources, and these are the same ones we reviewed in the earlier figure with where the money comes from. A quick glance at the differing colors of these bar graphs demonstrate two very different revenue models. The Group of 5 on the right receives about 61% of its budget from the institution's general fund and student fees, shown in red and orange. For the Power 5 on the left, the red and orange don't even show up. Rather, most of these athletic departments generate the majority of revenues from media rights, ticket sales, and donor contributions. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Scott Hirko, to break down the revenue and expense trends for these FBS programs.
Thank you, Amy. We will explore the finances of Division I further using data from the Commission's CAFI database, and all of the following data presented are adjusted for inflation. One way that we can understand the increase of money impacting the Power 5 is to look at the growth in revenue in purple and the growth in expenses in orange at Power 5 public institutions over the previous decade. After adjusted for inflation in aggregate, budgets have increased about 65% to around $6.4 billion for revenues and expenses. The takeaway here is that as you see athletics revenues increase, they are almost equitably put back into athletics expenses. The more you make, the more you spend. This is an example of revenue allocation theory at work, and we'll see that more money is spent on the areas that generate the greatest revenue, particularly in the Power 5. So the next several slides, we'll look at some of the biggest drivers of expenses among FBS institutions. First, in the Power 5, this slide highlights the growth in coaching salaries, which is one of the big expense items. Growth in athletic scholarships, also known as student aid, is also shown here. The growth in coaching salaries for all sports in the Power 5 has exploded in the past 10 years, greater than the amount being spent to support college athletes' scholarships and their cost of attendance. When adjusted for inflation, the CAFI database shows an increase of 99% for football coaching salaries and benefits at public Power 5 institutions, as seen in the green, up to $510 million for 520 coaches, or nearly $1 million a coach. In blue, the 2,500 plus coaches in other sports received a 64% increase in salaries and benefits up to $640 million. And the 30,000 plus athletes saw a 53% increase in scholarship expenses up to a total of $718 million in orange. The takeaway here is that football coaching compensation for 10 coaching positions per institution at the Power Five is growing at a faster rate than all other coaches and at almost twice the rate of scholarships for all college athletes. Now let's see the same thing and a comparison of rate of change for athlete student aid compared to coaches' compensation in the group of five. This takeaway tells a much different story. Actually, in the group of five, after adjusted for inflation over the same 10-year period, football coaching salaries, again in green, increased 61% to $167 million for 550 coaches. Meanwhile, student aid or scholarships in orange for nearly 24,000 athletes increased 51% to $439 million, and compensation to coaches of other sports other than football increased 35%, as shown in blue. As you can see, athletic scholarships increased at a faster rate than the compensation for the more than 2,000 non-football coaching salaries and benefits. Another big expense driver over the past decade has been non-coaching staff compensation and severance pay. These positions would include administration, sports-specific non-coaching staff, and other athletic staff. In this graph, Power 5 schools are shown in purple and the group of five in blue. By charting out the rate of growth over time, once again, the Power 5 schools experienced a high rate of staff administration compensation. Adjusted for inflation, the group of five in blue increased staff compensation and severance pay 40% to $338 million at 55 public institutions. The Power Five in purple, with more financial resources, increased staff pay and severance pay 76% to $1.24 billion in 2018 at 52 public institutions. The takeaway here, first, with much more money, Power 5 athletics programs spend 4 times more on non-coaching staff than group of five schools. This is likely higher pay along with much more personnel. Secondly, the Power 5 staff compensation is growing twice as fast, 76% to 40%. The increasing revenue being made is going back into staff and coaches at an alarming rate. It's not a surprise with the COVID pandemic that media have reported furloughs or layoffs among college athletic staff, particularly at the Power Five. So let's look at another big expense driver, and that's payments on athletics debt. The CAFI database, again, uses data reported by public institutions to examine athletically related debt. As of 2018, FBS public institutions encumbered more than $9.2 billion in athletics debt, with a vast majority, or $7.4 billion, among the Power Five. Consider the group of five has more institutions than the Power Five, yet the Power Five has 4 times more debt than the group of five. The takeaway here is that for years, Power Five institutions have used the increases in revenues to build, expand, or improve facilities for the athletics with the expectation that the revenues will always be there to support paying the annual debt service payments. This is challenging for many institutions because the COVID pandemic has severely strained the normal revenue streams that were relied on to make the debt service payments. So you could get deeper into the data and the finances using the Knight Commission's CAFI database, which we'll explore here. I won't provide a tutorial on how to use the CAFI database at this point, but a 4-minute tutorial is available on the homepage and at the top of each page. But for instance, you can look at the FBS profile page and see the different revenue and expense categories. Because of the COVID pandemic, the CAFI database has proved to be a useful resource to learn about the financial impact on sports. Here, you can see revenues from ticket sales, which is impacted by the pandemic. You can isolate ticket sales using the special cutting tool feature. And many conferences are going to conference-only schedules, which impacts traditional competition guarantees paid to schools for non-conference matchups. Again, using that same cutting tool feature, you can isolate competition guarantees. Finally, there is a powerful tool available at the CAFI database, which is the custom reporting tool. This tool provides all the different revenues and expense variables with filters to run a report by institution, by conferences, or a combination of schools and conferences. You can also sort the data by year. So if you have any questions, you can always feel free to contact me. I can be reached at the bottom at the top of each page with a Contact Us button. Now I'd like to turn this back over to Amy Perko to introduce our next guest and to moderate questions and answers.
Thank you, Scott. Scott and I covered the historical trends and the current status of Division I finances. We're showing this slide again on how the Power 5 conference revenues changed since 2005 to remind you of the big jumps that occurred. Our guest presenter, AJ Maestas, will talk about what the future may hold for these programs if historical trends return after the pandemic. AJ?
Hey there, everybody. What you're looking at on your screen right here is our projection of the next decade of distribution from the Power 5 conferences quoted on a per university basis. So certainly no one can perfectly predict the future, but it is our intent to be on the right side of history. So we've taken the liberty, as you look at this information, to make a few assumptions. One, you'll notice in 2026, there's a uptick for all of the conferences. That's our prediction on the next CFP deal, where we assume it'll move to 8 invitations from 4, which will almost quadruple the revenue from the CFP. You'll also notice steep inclines for the Big 10, Big 12, and Pac-12 at the time in which their new media rights agreements come online. So just for a little bit of context, we've had the good fortune of working with almost every major conference, all of the pro sports leagues, all the major networks and broadcasters. And this modeling is built off of some generally accepted metrics that are highly predictive of where the market will go. Things like cost per viewer, or revenue per viewer, revenue per fan, things like compound annual growth rate, which you would view in the pro sports marketplace, or even the history of collegiate athletics. But with all that said, you can see, much as Amy and Scott have shared with us up to this point, we're predicting the next decade to look a lot like the last decade, where revenue at the Power 5 level from media will far outgain other revenue sources and significantly outgain similar revenue sources like media from lower divisions, like the Group of 5.
Thank you, AJ.
Yeah.
So to review, the key points we've covered here: across Division I, there's been a widening gap in financial resources. FBS football, particularly in the Power 5, has accelerated the widening gap. Trends for the Power 5 conferences prior to the pandemic demonstrate disproportionate increases in football coaching salaries, non-coaching administrative staff, and facilities expenditures. The pandemic will have a huge impact on the fiscal year 20 and 21 due to a lack of financial reserves. The impact beyond fiscal year 21 is uncertain. The big question is whether prior trends will return. As Dr. Cartwright noted at the start, the Knight Commission is considering changes that should be made to the Division I model. Looking ahead, these are key questions. Where will the money go? Where should the money go? And what could a new model look like? So that concludes our presentation, breaking down Division I finances And I'll turn it over to our moderator, Jenny Terzano. Again, if you have a question, please click on the Q&A icon on your control panel. If you're a member of the media, please identify your affiliation. Please also identify the presenter to whom the question is directed. And following the Q&A, Dr. Cartwright will have some comments regarding our future sessions.
Thanks, Amy. We have a question from Christopher Worley. Has anything materially changed in the legal environment since the NCAA last tried to cap assistant football coach salaries that would allow for some limitation of coach compensation?
I'll jump in on that. As noted in the question, back in the 90s, the NCAA did have legislation that was restricted earnings coach legislation, and that was ruled to violate antitrust. So there really hasn't been anything material that has changed that would allow any type of capping of coaches' salaries.
Patrick Ruby has a question and is asking, what accounts for the Power 5 debt numbers? That is, do you have a more detailed breakdown of what those schools are borrowing for?
The athletics debt numbers, again, these are drawn from NCAA financial reports filed by every public Division I institution. And so in the NCAA financial report, it doesn't break down specific categories of athletics debt, whether it be football stadium improvements or a new basketball arena. So it is an aggregate number. But obviously the $9 billion in athletics debt also brings with it a huge annual debt service payment. Again, that's available on our database, and for Division I, it's over $700 million a year in debt service payments.
Sean Dotson is asking, does the Knight Commission track on what percentage of overall institutional expenditure athletics are at these public institutions?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? And Scott, if you want to jump in on this, you can.
Sure. Sean Dotson is asking whether the Knight Commission is tracking what percentage of overall institutional expenditure athletics takes place at the public institutions.
If you go to the CAFI database, overall academic spending is being tracked for each institution. And so you could actually download the raw data and come up with a percentage of how much of that goes towards athletics. Historically, institutions pay between 4 and 8% of the entire institutional budget goes to athletics. But that said, you could actually get into the raw data by going to the CAFI database and downloading it and comparing athletics budgets to overall institutional budgets.
Great, thank you. Daniel Venier, and I apologize if I mess up some of the last names. He is asking, what do you all think is the most important area to study empirically in order to drive change?
I'll jump in on that, and if Carol or Scott, you have any other thoughts as well, and AJ, obviously from the Knight Commission's perspective, we did create the CAFI database not only to reflect the current data, but to look at historical trends. And as the data show, there's just a vast majority of differences among those Division I schools. Obviously a concern as institutional budgets get tighter as a result of the pandemic. Frankly, there's a concern in terms of how much, of institutional support can go towards athletics moving forward, and what those trends have been. And then, if there are strains there, what might be a solution, particularly for those schools. I might add as well, one of the things that has come up before is that, of course, with a lot of Division I sports, many athletes are on partial scholarships or they're walk-ons. And those athletes are generating tuition revenue for a university. Those data are not reflected in the NCAA financial report. So I think that's an area, of study in terms of, particular universities and what athletics means to the university from a tuition generating standpoint. Scott?
I'll
Yeah.
jump in for a little additional commentary. I think the reason that the Knight Commission decided to develop the database in the first place is that we felt that more transparency about these financial issues would be important. That's certainly proving to be the case. If you think about the structure of the NCAA, it's been decades since there's been any significant change in the basic model. And yet, as we see from the presentation that Amy and Scott have just made, the financial landscape has changed dramatically. And we think this is one of the key reasons that points us to a discussion about structural and governance issues, which we will address later on in this series of forums.
Thanks, Dr. Cartwright. To add to this and to help to respond to the question, there's 3 areas that we highlighted for a particular reason in our presentation, and that's coaching compensation, staff and administrative compensation, which includes severance pay for coaches, as well as athletics debt. And so those are 3 areas that you have seen a substantial increase across FBS, but then the increase is even greater when you compare the Power 5 to the Group of 5. And as you see a widening gap between those two, and the pandemic has come to the realization of how do you save money or make decisions when your budget is being strained. And those are 3 areas I think that we should consider focusing on.
We have a question from Karen Weaver that she would like to direct to AJ. Can you talk in more detail about the reasons behind the significant media revenue increases in the next 3 to 5 years?
Thank you, Karen. I hope that's the Karen I know from Penn. One of the reasons is that's a natural step forward that takes place when you get another bite at the apple. Those are new TV deals being signed. The rate of appreciation of those rights way outstrip normal inflation. So there's always this step forward on a new TV deal, but there are other reasons. If you think of the TV landscape as a whole, nothing is more powerful than American football. And here we are at the collegiate level, just below the NFL. As an example, 8 or 9 of the most watched things on American television any given year is sports, mostly football. So if you think of the TV model and threats from the Netflixes of the world where you can watch a library, why do you pay your TV cable or satellite bundle anymore? It's mostly live sport that drives you for that appointment-based viewing. So holding that legacy model together is pretty much sport, and American football, again, is valuable as you can get. If I can help quantify that a little bit, as dramatic as that step forward is, we were trying to hit the midpoint. We think it could easily be higher, just as it could easily be lower. The NFL gets twice as much revenue per fan than college athletics does. So as dramatic as that is, it's possible that it's even better.
Thanks. Jake Gibbons has a question. What potential consequences or benefits might these trends have on the D1 student athlete experience in the years ahead?
Thanks for that question. That's one of the focuses that has been of the Knight Commission, and one of its driving principles is that the financial resources that college sports generates should really go primarily to supporting athlete education, health, safety, and success. So, that's an area that a study that we would recommend as well is looking at the growth rates over time. We have seen obviously increases in the pandemic certainly requires more focus on health and safety, but even before the pandemic, there were more resources being devoted, and rightfully so, to health and safety. mental health in particular of athletes. And again, just as a goal, that's really what the Knight Commission believes should be the priority, is putting those financial resources into the athletes' education and their health, safety, and success.
And as you look at the current system, the incentives are really not there to direct some of the dollars into programs that support the academic, the education of the student athletes. One of the things the Knight Commission argued for and eventually was able to influence the NCAA to do was to change the formula for the basketball tournament revenue distribution so that there's now a variable in there related to an academic incentive. But it was years and years of discussion before that particular action was taken. And I think it just demonstrates that by and large, the incentives to direct dollars toward educational mission are not there.
And to Carol's point, she gave a teaser as well for one of our next sessions that will look at the incentives of the NCAA revenue distribution, as well as the college football playoff distribution in our next session on September 30th.
Andrew Zimlist has made a couple points, and I'm asking if you would like to comment on them. The problem, he says, is significantly worse than what we discussed today. A large share of capital expenses are not included in school reports, in most cases because the facility debt is issued by the school or the state and does not appear in the athletics budget. A variety of indirect expenses are also excluded. Does anyone have thoughts about this?
You want me to take that, Amy, or?
Yeah. Let me just jump in first, and then
Sure.
Scott, you can add some points. I would just thank Andy Zimbalist for his comment and for the work that he does in this area. And, you know, we agree generally that, you know, the athletic debt expenses that are published in these reports and that we've described today are, you know, likely very conservative. But again, it's after years of requesting different types of improvements to the NCAA financial reports, we feel it's important, you know, that debt was included, and obviously this is the way to again provide more transparency with regard to athletics debt in the overall equation here. Scott?
Yeah, and thank you, Andy, for all the work that you've done. And I would agree that what you're seeing is something that's conservative. The CAFI database is the only place that you can go to look at athletically related debt and debt service for public institutions with respect to Division I sports. So I encourage people to go to that and ask the question, because these are questions that are very challenging. And they differ greatly from one institution to the next, but it's up to the institution to report what is athletically related debt. And if they decide to spend in another area of the institution on something that is related to athletics, that's something that should be reported, but not always is, because institutions have their autonomy on how best to report on the NCAA report forms, including for debt.
Greg Earhart is asking you, Amy, and he makes a comment. He says that he really appreciates this, and perhaps this is not a question that can be addressed here, but the Knight Commission has been the voice of reason since 1989, he notes. At this point, what levers are available to help move the needle on these issues?
Thanks, Greg. I'll take a stab at that, and Carol and Jonathan, Scott, if you want to jump in. You know, Greg, I know, is the leader of the Swimming Coaches Association, and Greg's leadership, along with the many others of the various coaches association, is more important now more than ever. Obviously, again, we looked at the sports across the board, and obviously there have been sports cut across the board, which is, you know, in our view, very unfortunate and should have been a last resort. In terms of moving change, again, the commission will have recommendations in a variety of areas. We will be discussing national shared revenue distributions and the incentives associated with those in our next session. And as it relates to how to bring about change, that now is, we believe, the window of opportunity for significant change to happen. As Carol noted, the NCAA model hasn't really changed very much since 1973. And obviously the financial landscape is very, very different from that time. So again, in terms of a group of people coming together, working with university presidents to change the model will be, the next step. Obviously, federal lawmakers are also getting involved with college sports issues, but ultimately, college sports leaders, university presidents need to have consensus about the changes that they believe will best serve college sports, athletes, and their universities moving forward.
And the Knight Commission has a legacy of influencing change. And one of the levers that we use for that is a good base of facts and data. And in this session, obviously, we've talked about that, but we'll also talk again at the next session about a different way to look at the incentives and the variables that drive some of these behaviors. And then following that, we'll talk about some of the perceptions and attitudes that exist within the world of college sport. And then that will culminate in a set of recommendations where partly we'll be laying out what we see as the barriers to change and what we see as the levers to change. But that's been a model that's been successful for us over the years, is to tackle a problem, get a good solid base of information, put forward thoughtful recommendations, and then be pretty relentless about persuading and influencing that change.
Scott Benson is asking, given the trends demonstrated, noting that this focus has been on FBS institutions, what's the future for FCS and D1, around football? This may be a question for you, AJ.
My apologies, I was typing an answer to someone.
Sure, I will repeat it. The focus was on FBS institutions. Given the trends demonstrated, what is the future for FCS and D1? No football?
I think it'll always be there because we value it as a society and we'll find a way to subsidize it. But if you were an alien and you landed on planet Earth today and you looked at this landscape and you especially with our sort of ethos, our belief, that we want to have a meritocracy, right? And it should be a level playing field. And certainly I think everyone listening to this believes in full, sort of sound mind and body and all the benefits that come from athletics. Then you'd say it'll be there, but what in the world are they doing competing for resources and playing on the same field together? So I think it'll survive. It'll just probably look a lot more like the Ivy Leagues, right? With less scholarships based on athletic performance to allow the financial model to, fit and play. And should they be stepping on a field? There's no other division or sports conference in the world that has more than 32 members. That's here in the US with a couple of the leagues. Most are in the teens around the world. And here we have over 100 members competing against one another, some with 1/10 the budget of the others. So yeah, I think it'll survive, but this can't continue as it is. You cannot step on the field, right? With that disparity.
AJ, that's good. If I could add to that, and what the pandemic has revealed is that a lot of those FCS teams, particularly for football, they may get competition guarantees to play those in the Power Five. And with the pandemic and the change of football to conference-only schedules means that there's less money in competition guarantees that are available for the FCS. So that adds more pressure to the budgets for those FCS teams that rely more significantly upon those guarantees.
We've had a couple questions around Olympic sports. I'm going to combine a couple of them. Most of the 87 Division I sports teams have been dropped this year, are Olympic sports. Amy, if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the future of Olympic sports, and if you could wave a magic wand, what change do you believe is needed to improve the financial sustainability to save these Olympic non-revenue generating sports?
Yes, thank you for the question. And again, I want to get back to, the principles of the core reason to have college sports is to provide educational opportunities through sports, not just through 2 or 3 sports. And so again, from our perspective, it's really unfortunate to see the cuts being made across the board. And as I mentioned, in our next session, we will talk about the revenue distribution models from the NCAA basketball tournament and the college football playoff that provide incentives for schools based on the formulas. And I would say without, there's a lot of issues we'll cover in that session, but one of the key questions that I think one could ask is, are schools really being incentivized in the way that, was originally intended to sponsor a broad base opportunities in sports? And for various reasons, those incentives are not as powerful as they once were. And they're skewed in ways that really don't accomplish that goal. So I think that's an important question as we look at the study of, how might revenue distribution be changed to provide incentives that go back to that core of, are we incentivizing, providing opportunities in a broad range of sports? So that's one of the issues. The second goes to the expense side, and we have also, as part of our examination, surveyed Division I leaders. We will be announcing the results of that survey in our 3rd session on October 6th. But that survey and kind of those issues get to, are there better ways to organize this model so that it is more cost efficient and it does provide more regional competition maybe for some of the non-revenue sports and can become, a more cost-effective model that may look different than the FBS football model in terms of the competitors or conference affiliation as an example. But there are opportunities, we believe, on both the revenue side in terms of what's incentivized, as well as the expense side.
Thanks, Amy. We have a number of terrific questions in the queue, but we are limited on time, so this will likely be the last question. And I would like to ask Jim Zimmerman's question from the University of St. Mary. Will the concept of amateurism survive at the NCAA FBS level, and is it a priority for the Knight Commission?
So I'll take a first shot at that, and Carol and Jonathan, if you want to jump in with any comments on this last question. Again, as Dr. Cartwright noted at the outset, this was last December when the Knight Commission announced that we felt it was time to really look at an overhaul of the Division I model. And we cited a couple of things, including the highly commercial environment of FBS football, in particular at the Power 5 level. And some of the questions that we've looked at today, I think, are troubling to us in terms of where there's been tremendous growth in revenues, but where has that money gone, and has it gone to the right places that strengthen this educational model of college sports? And I think we all agree, and there are many who agree that no, it has not. And that's why federal lawmakers are holding hearings. That's why state legislators are getting involved. And so it's up to college sports leaders to really identify what is the right model moving forward, and what should this model do in terms of prioritizing where the money goes in college sports.
I think you put it very well, Amy. So we'll move on to conclude this session, and We want to inform you about the other sessions. They're certainly going to address some of the questions that have been raised. Session 2 is a new analysis of the D1 revenue distribution formula in equities. This 60-minute virtual forum will be on Wednesday, September 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please go to the Knight Commission website or check your email boxes for registration details. This session will examine the financial distributions from the 2 marquee events for NCAA Division I and FBS football, the NCAA men's basketball tournament and the FBS college football playoff. While the NCAA runs the basketball tournament, the college football playoff is managed independent of the NCAA. And these distributions send nearly $1 billion to Division I athletics programs annually. During the session on September 30th, the Knight Commission will release new findings from an analysis conducted by Clifton Larson Allen that shows the financial impact of FBS football factors on the NCAA revenue distribution plan. This is important because the NCAA does not receive revenues from FBS football. Then session 3 on Tuesday, October 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time will be about what D1 leaders think, new survey findings about reform. This session will release key findings of the Knight Commission's 2020 survey results of Division I campus leaders' views of Division I governance and structure and potential alternative models. And finally, session 4 will be the capstone to the previous 3 public forums. In this session, the Knight Commission will provide recommendations for change to the current D1 model, and we'll be announcing this date at a later time. Again, you could register for these forums at knightcommission.org or check your email boxes for registration information. Thank you. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you again on September 30th.